Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Jun Jeon. I'm an assistant professor of sociology at Chungnam National University. I'm going to be the moderator of our first plenary session this afternoon. First of all, thank you very much for all participants in this room, despite your busy schedule. I'm very honored and feel very pleased to be a moderator of a very important and timely event like this today. In our first plenary session, we have a set of wonderful presentations prepared regarding Science Museum in many different countries abroad. Let me introduce our speakers in our first plenary session. In sequence of the presentation, first, Professor Mohri Mamoru, President of Japanese Science Museum Association, and Professor John Durant, Director of the MIT Museum. And we have Professor Sungook, Professor of Science Studies at Seoul National University. Professor Mohri Mamoru, from the President of Japanese Science Museum Association. Professor Mamoru will give his presentation entitled An Asian Approach to Science Museums for Global Citizens. Professor Mamoru, please come to the podium for your presentation.
안녕하세요. Good afternoon. Well, first, please allow me to offer my sincere condolences to you and good people of Korea for your recent tragic loss. I thank you for this opportunity to address in the ISSM 2022, focusing on an Asian approach to science museums for global citizens. For 20 years, until last year, I was the Chief Executive Director of the National Museum of Emerging Science and Innovation, or as we call it, Miraikan. We challenged ourselves to create a new type of science museum by fashioning an approach to enhance visitors' experiences and therefore help each guest consider how to acquire a global perspective. This new challenge for Science Museum was based upon my experience of 2 space flights, because those flights changed my perspectives of life on this planet. Let me share a journey with you, first from orbit and realizations of the universe that transcended to recognizing a personal relationship with this planet of life. How I then gained a deeper appreciation to life forms' sustainability. That transformed into a global approach. My first space shuttle mission was 1992, and my second mission was in 2000. My first mission was dedicated to conducting science experiment in the unique environment of weightlessness. I was a teacher to students in a program called Classroom in Space. That was the first real-time TV education session connecting space, NASA, and Japan, and it became a nationwide science communication event. My second mission was devoted to Earth observation to make a 3-dimensional map of the world, particularly to the land masses. The result of this mission have been utilizing extensively in cartography, as you are familiar with it, in everyday life, as seen on a smartphone, like a Google map. Well, let me take you back to the most unusual workplace I've ever experienced in the Space Shuttle endeavor. This is Space Shuttle Space Laboratory on my first mission. On this mission, I conducted experiments such as processing new semiconductors, alloys, and protein crystals. One of the experiments I conducted in space was to examine through a microscope how living cells behaved in microgravity. And I took many microscopic pictures, as you see in here, like this. After long, intense concentration, I took a break and looked out a window to the earth below. I was stunned and unable to take my eyes away. The image of the earth was amazingly similar to the microscopic image I had been just viewing. I then understood our planet could be viewed as a living entity unto itself, just like the cells. That made me stop and realize that the only difference was the relativity of scale. Everything, therefore, on Earth is connected, with each connected to a larger entity. Continue the progression, and eventually this relates to our solar system, the galaxy, and the universe. I found this is also true with the concept of space, time, life, and matter, all of which we are aware and all of which are connected. This connected concept has been long been known and accepted in ASEAN. One of my NASA colleagues told me my perception of my space experiences were a bit different from ordinary Western astronauts. I then realized that I myself was an Asian astronaut. Excuse me, I should take off this one, mask, because the distance, social distance is long enough. Sorry. I expressed myself, my experience based upon my own Asian viewpoint, rather than ordinary, conventional type of astronauts. It is important to remember that every person is a vital part of the whole. And as each person develops a deeper understanding of science and technology, and a better awareness of all which is around us, the greater the connection, including the connection to each other. How we can understand this connection system. This understanding I call universology. And I defined universology is a view of understanding an entity as it is from every aspect, including beyond our recognition. My 2 shuttle missions gave me a new appreciation of Earth, with its wondrous diversity of life forms that coexist on our planet, all within a very thin, fragile atmosphere. All life shares DNA, as well as shares our planet. Space is pitch dark, even though the sun is shining, but the surface of the Earth reflecting the sunlight is so beautiful, shining in blue and white. Please take a look. You see oceans, forests, deserts, coral reefs, but no humans. You cannot recognize human existence until you flew into nighttime. Changes all that, and human existence is clearly on display. An alien can easily see in forms due to this illumination connected by electric power. At night, you see bright orange illumination light everywhere when you pass above land masses. I first flew 30 years ago, and at that time, 5.5 billion humans' existence packed the continents. 8 years later, on my second flight, the population was 6.1 billion. And 30 years later, 2022 this year, 8 billion people. I had a foreboding feeling and foresaw a sudden decrease of the human population in the not too distant future. This is not, of course, not scientifically, but in addition to the orange illumination, what you are seeing in the outer space of the planet is beautiful and already very much deadly and forever changed my life. This is what I saw as the space shuttle flew through the aurora. Look at it again and keep in mind the aurora is a result of deadly solar winds. That's not what changed my experiences, my perspectives of life. Rather, it was the thin, delicate atmosphere that covers and protects Earth from the dangers of cosmic radiation and allows all life to exist. That changed me. Then I began to think of how we arrived at where we are today. This diagram shows a variation of average temperature of the Earth within the last 100,000 years. We have been lucky over the last 10,000 years as the average temperature has been warm and steady. That period is called Holocene. Before that period, our ancestors had been exposed to an ice age of more than 100,000 years and survived by animal hunting, which forced humans to follow the moving herds, and thus they lived without a settlement. Humans suffered shortages of food in a freezing environment all the time. Because the interglacial period, Holocene, began about 10,000 years ago, our species invented agriculture and made it possible to stay in a permanent place, a community. I believe this innovation of technology, agriculture, provided a unique, sustainable lifestyle. It separated the human species from other life forms. Since the start of agriculture, the human population increased, and that population has greatly accelerated in recent decades due to many additional wisdom, particularly from science and technology. Now, the population is 8 billion as of this month, according to the demographic data published by the United Nations. They announced, now we reached 8 billion. Well, as Chief Executive Director of Miraikan, I was very much aware of the possibility of sudden decrease in the human population. I felt instinctively as I saw from space. The crowd humans on each continent, and I wanted to share those concerns. We proposed a new role for the Science Museum. How Science Museum can contribute to future society through cutting-edge science and technology. We set a vision with the idea of 10 billion people sustaining their lives on Earth. Miraikan therefore designs, develops, and delivers science communication activities to all, collaborating with science museums and other stakeholders around the globe with the goal of discovering solutions to global challenges. Many of the world's leaders embraced this approach and visited Miraikan, as you can be seen here. This new mission resulted in realizing a new era in cooperation with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. A new era began when the human species acquired a global view from space, as it convinced us that our planet is the only environment we have to sustain our species, much like a spaceship, our Earth. Then at the beginning of this century, we had a genome view on the atomic level as the human genome was analyzed. Science showed that the human species is not so special. Among the diversified earthbound life forms, from the viewpoint of DNA sequence, Earth is a part of the universe beyond specific design, and yet all Earth life forms are connected. In the last 3 years, and even now, we have been suffering from COVID-19. It seems that we humans have become complacent in our good fortune. And now our planet is quickly bringing us back to reality. At the same time, humans have been threatening diversity of earthbound life forms and resulting in sharp decrease in biodiversity. We need measures to deal with this in order to sustain humanity. We should realize that science and technology provided a new perspective of Tanagari. Tanagari in Japanese means a relationship or connection developed over time. That concept developed into the Triangle of Tanagari. Every life form consists of microbes, cells, and even viruses. Viruses play important roles in the creation and functional life of cells. Viruses are components of earthbound life forms and have and do exist within all life forms all the time. And that includes microbes too. But let me start with living cells. And for cells to be sustained, they need atmosphere, light, and temperature. We now move to the individual human. And I call that the Tanagari of the individual. The individual Tanagari is designed to sustain the individual with essences of life such as food, air, water, sleep, and shelter. But the individual lifespan is very short, around 100 years at most. To continue life, we needed a generational tsunagari as well as an individual tsunagari. And that combination is what we call societies. The following step is called the tsunagari of society with the goal of sustaining human life. A human society is made up of many cultures, such as, and in no particular order, religion, military, government, politics, arts, education, business, and science, to name a few. No one culture alone can sustain a society. Rather, each culture contributes its wisdom to the whole. This society concept worked quite well until humans started having major impacts on our planet. Now, we, as a species, are aware of global problems that affect all life. Just as no one individual can sustain a society, no one society can sustain our planet. To sustain our human species, we must sustain the natural environment of Earth, so we must progress to the tsunagari of the planet of life. A transformation designed to sustain all life through the integration of all of combined wisdom from all societies into a global wisdom by means of science communication. It is important to realize that humans are just one of over 50 million life forms, and all are connected through the global environment with the key words of biodiversity, sustainability, symbiosis, and genome, and so forth. In order to bring all this together, we deserve a fresh perspective of our Earth and therefore the sustainability of the human race. You might remember earlier, I defined universology as a view of understanding an entity as it is from every aspect, including beyond our recognition. The conventional specific approach to understand what is in the world in the past is to pursue analysis of a focused target as small as possible to find elemental parts. After each element was understood, scientists would then compose and build the original target. This is a logical way generally accepted by traditional science. This is known as the element reduction method. But scientists were not able to deal with future issues since their prediction cannot be proved until it will come to be realized in the future. Examples could be the average temperature rise on the Earth, the decrease of biodiversity, and the increase of influential diseases, all residing in the future. Because of the rapid development of information and computation technology through the internet system, scientists were provided with tools for new scientific methods to be invented. We can now project the future Earth environment scientifically. We are in the middle of human evolution. And now, artificial intelligence is creating super nature and super reality. Some refer to this as the metaverse, a hypothetical of the internet as a single, universal, and immersive virtual world that is facilitated by artificial intelligence or AI. The use of virtual reality, VR, and augmented reality, AR. These give you an extension, your abilities to broaden your vision of reality. Americans' symbol exhibit that Geocosmos is an example of employing the metaverse to help people see our planet with fresh eyes.
Geocosmos is the world's first self-emitted interactive Earth display. It gives a realistic expression of the Earth shining in space with high precision exceeding 10 million pixels. Geocosmos uses organic LED panels which are loaded as a next-generation display. Geocosmos interactively displays artist creations and Earth observation data gathered from research institutes around the world, and you can view the current Earth as it changes.
I believe this exhibit results in a new appreciation of Earth, the past Earth, the present Earth, and the possible future Earth. For example, the rising temperatures of the planet and the ever-widening impact now and into the future of global warming. By seeing the Geocosmos, the visitor is energized to ask questions and voice concerns on what each person can do at this moment to sustain Earth. The metaverse offers a unique opportunity to have an advanced second chance perspective. That fresh perspective will be provided by science centers and museums through practical, understandable science communication for all people. This means inclusiveness, and we must make the information accessible because we need all to participate to meet the never-before-seen global challenges that face all life on this planet. Since science communication can make a difference, and together we can improve and take positive action. By the way, this Geocosmos we built 20 years ago, 22 years ago actually, but now is used for a kind of metaverse with AI. We share these common concerns, and we must honor, respect, and celebrate each science museum's uniqueness, because diversity cultivates creativity, and the world needs creative solutions more than ever before. The common ground, the Asian philosophy of the Tanagari, of sharing this planet, is our foundation for cooperation and collaboration in discovering new solutions. Asia is unique in relating to nature, and we naturally embrace the United Nations SDGs. Science is a logical method to explain and understand nature, precisely analyzing all aspects. Yet, another Asian perspective is to see the whole rather than the singular or individual, a holistic approach. This is essential to sustain Earth environment. We, science museums, can readily embrace, incorporate, and share these visions as new roles Remember, the concept that all are connected, not just humans, because we humans easily forget that there are over 50 million other life species on Earth. All are instinctively connected, a natural phenomenon, and always have been as Tsunagari. This is our planet of life, and we are in this together. So, together we can sustain the Earth environment that in turn will help us sustain our species. Thank you. 감사합니다.
Thank you very much, Professor Mamoru. Please give a big round of applause for Professor Mamoru again. I think it was a wonderful presentation introducing us the concept of universology as a new approach of science that is for the purpose of the recovery of the connectivity, not only among human beings, but also among human and non-human beings altogether. And it was really impressive to see the new role of Science Museum for the project. So from now on, we are going to collect the questions from the audience here, and also we are accepting questions in the YouTube channel as well. So if you have any question, please write your question in YouTube channel as well. So first of all, I would like to turn our microphone for the audience in the floor. 예, 질문해 주시죠.
Any questions?
네, 감사합니다.
Thank you very much for your presentation. So, I'd like to ask a question. I hope that my Korean is translated into English.
먼저 발표하셨던 논문에서
During your presentation, of course, I have a question, but before asking my question, I'd like to pay my condolences to the victims of the Itaewon accident, and I'd like to also thank you for your condolences expressed. So, thank you very much. So, I have a question. I have a question related to universology and Tsunagari.
일본이나 아시아적 관점에서
From the perspective of Japan and Asia, I have a question related to the space exploration. There are some space projects that are being pursued by Korean and Japanese entities, and I think the projects are now related to Tsunagari. Rather, those projects should be driven by human interest. In the past, in space shuttle ships, there were many experiments conducted on Earth phenomenon, and you also had experiments on microbes in the universe or in space. So now that we are gathered here for this symposium, I would like to understand, based on universe or space-centered space exploration, what is the difference of it when it's compared to human-centered space exploration? If we have human-centered space exploration, do you have specific advice for us so that we can better pursue human-centered space exploration? I am a journalist Lee Gi-jong from one of the news media that basically covers space-related news.
Thank you for the question. You pointed out very interesting objectives of the space exploration. Well, you said so far, space exploration has been conducted by human-centered. Well, generally speaking, because only human can explore into space, and due to we gained science and technology. And some people who worked in such a exploration, they simply because curiosity-driven reason for space exploration. Well, we would like to know more nature. That is very natural for scientists, researchers to driven their motivation. The second one, present maybe exploration is a kind of business-driven, because through space exploration or space activities, we'll be able to vitalize society through economic business activity enhanced. So generally two reasons, but both of them, as you mentioned, human-centered. However, I also went up in space as a program of human-centered, but this is not my mission or project mission. Of course, not our government mission, but just simply, I saw outside of spaceship, space shuttle, through window. I discovered something, and I felt why I came to this place. And what I'm seeing, what is that? I had a chance to think, consider. Not mainly during the orbit, but after came back. Because I didn't understand why I wanted to go to space from my childhood so eagerly. So I thought and thought, well, there should be some motivation for that, or even though my individual experience. But there should be some motivation for all such activities, not only space exploration, but business, arts, space, politics, religion, military, including. I came to the conclusion that, oh, this is a kind of sustainability of life, individual or group, but then since I saw globe, this Earth from distance, so many already humans occupied the surface of this Earth, just inside of very thin layer of atmosphere. Then I decided, the reason I went up into space, okay, not religious meaning, no religion, but as a scientist, I thought, well, I should let as many people as possible to know the real view from space. That's a motivation. Did I answer your question? Okay, thank you. Universology, sounds like a religious word, but no, not at all. Actually, myself and NASA colleagues created this word together, because my NASA colleagues, when they talked after the mission, we talked a lot. Then, Mamoru, your perspective is a bit different. I haven't heard. So that we discussed. Then what is the appropriate word, English word should be. Then we created recognition of the universe as universology.
Thank you very much. More questions from the floor, please?
Thank you, Professor Mamoru, for your great speech. I'm undergraduate student studying astronomy and space science in Gyeonggi University. 지금부터는 영어로 질문하도록
So let me ask my question in Korean. So since you're not astronaut, maybe if it's okay, I'd like to ask this question to you. Recently, I had an engagement with people who believes in flat Earth. Instead of confronting their belief, maybe I thought it is critical to provide correct scientific knowledge and information to the general public. If there are people who distribute wrong scientific information, what science museum should do to confront their belief, the wrong scientific belief that, for example, the Earth is flat?
Well, good question. Thank you. Until actually I went up in space and saw real Earth, I knew that as a knowledge, Earth is round, floating in space, but I was not very much convinced. Then I went up in the last mission, second mission. Second mission was a kind of Earth observation mission, so I had to see the surface of the ground, surface of the Earth all the time, 12 hours a day. Then, while I was busy working, I did not feel, but just as like a robot, I just did my job. But my ground control allowed us, okay, your job finished. You can use your time as you like. Then I saw freely outside for almost 3 hours. 3 hours means one orbit takes 90 minutes. So that almost twice I flew and saw the surface of the Earth. Then I was convinced Earth is round and floating, really floating in the dark space. That was amazing. That was amazing. That not from my knowledge, but from my experience. That kind of, as an experimental scientist, I believe what I really convinced. So it's not easy to let people who believe the surface of the Earth is flat. But at least you can take them using like a metaverse or virtual reality, which are taken by real, astronauts from space. Then people may change their belief. Even if you explain scientifically, I don't think they change their belief. I hope so. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Mamoru. Because of the time limitation, we have to proceed to our second presenter. So thank you very much. And our second presenter is Professor John Durant, Director of the MIT Museum. Please welcome Professor Durant.
This is what I use. Well, first of all, let me say thank you for inviting me here. I'd like to repeat what other speakers have done by expressing my condolences to this country for the tragic loss of life which happened so recently and so unexpectedly. It's heartbreaking when these things happen. I would also like to express, though, my thanks to the organizers of this symposium, to the Ministry of Science in Korea, to the Science Museum, the National Museum, and its leadership here for hosting this event in this wonderful auditorium, and also to the organizers of this symposium for bringing me across our circular earth to participate in this meeting. I'd like to welcome the audience who is online as well as the audience who is in the auditorium. And I want to make a few remarks which, as much as anything, come from my own recent experience of having the good fortune to oversee the construction of a new museum. So I am director of the MIT Museum, and that museum is about 50 years old, but from about, well, it feels like about 50 years ago, but I think it was more like about 7 years ago, we got the opportunity to move from our old, very difficult building into a brand new building with completely new contents. And so I had to think with my colleagues about what our values were and what our priorities were for the new museum. And not everybody gets that luxury, and it is a luxury, to think about such things. And I want to give you a little bit of a sense of what came out for me from this exercise in terms of what the priorities should be. Our museum is not strictly a science museum, it's the MIT Museum, but as you perhaps know, MIT does quite a lot of science and engineering, and so our museum is prevailingly to do with scientific and technological matters. So I hope that we count. Now, I'm going to take a leaf out of the book of our keynote speaker, and I'm going to try and walk about a bit. If I fall off the stage, I hope you will rescue me. I want to start with the obvious but rather basic question, what is a science museum? And you might wonder why on earth you might need to ask such a question. Here are some logos from a few science museums. I confess they were extracted by me more or less randomly from an online search. There are scores, hundreds of these things. Each science museum is, in a sense, a realization of a particular vision of what a science museum should be. I want us to stand back and ask, well, what do we think ought to be the nature, the character, the mission of a new museum of science? I'm going to offer you a very simplistic, but I hope helpful, set of alternatives as to what you might think is an answer to that question. So you might think, and I'm drawing here on a Western religious tradition, but you could as well use words like temple or pagoda or any religious metaphor that comes to you from anywhere in the world. You might think that a science museum ought to compare itself to a massive, if it's a big museum, religious institution. I've shown here one of my favorite museum spaces in the world, let me confess. It's the Great Hall of the Natural History Museum in London. This building, and I'm showing you a view of its ground floor, has at times been voted by Londoners as their favorite building in the capital. It's a Grade 1 listed building. It's preserved. They have to get permission before they can change anything in the building. This is a magnificent space, and you get some sense of its size by seeing that they have suspended the skeleton of a blue whale in the middle of the building. This is a large, big building. And that is how some of our great science museums look. And a building like this, I want to suggest, is designed more than anything else for spectacle. It is awe-inspiring to be in buildings like this, just as it can be awe-inspiring to be in a great cathedral or a great temple or a great mosque. Choose your example. So that's one model. If we want spectacle and awe, maybe we should be aspiring to be that kind of place. Take this as the second very different example. We might think that what we ought to be is a playground. This is actually a view of a particular museum. It's the Mississippi Museum of Natural Science. It's obviously the outdoor area. It looks a bit like a playground, does it not? And this is designed, of course, for amusement. And I offer you the thought that if you go to museums of science and technology around the world, you'll find quite a lot which look as if they are principally designed for amusement. That's a model. And by the way, I have nothing against amusement. And if you're trying to hook people, to catch people, and to encourage them to be interested in your subject, amusing them is not a bad thing to do. So that's the second completely different model. But here is a third and completely different model again. And you might be surprised I'm showing you an archaeological site when I'm offering you visions of what a science museum should be. But this is the Agora, to use a word derived from the Greek. In the Roman tradition, it would be called a forum. The Agora or forum is a place in the community where the citizens can gather to discuss the events of the day, the issues of the day, the policies of the day. The idea in the Western world goes straight back to the Greek city-state, and it offers the view that in a democratic citizenry, you need an opportunity for people to be able to come together to hammer out, as we say in English, to thrash out, to do what our keynote speaker referred to in another verb as wrestling. You can't wrestle alone. You can only wrestle with other people. So maybe if you need to wrestle your way through an understanding of what you should do in a difficult situation, maybe you need a place to do that. And the Agora, or the Forum, was such a place, expressly designed for that function. So this is the Roman Forum at Thessaloniki, and it's designed for civic conversation. Now, this is a huge, simplifying, you might say distorting, move that I'm making, but I'm offering these three as three very different models for what a science museum might think of itself as being. And as you can probably tell from the way I'm going, I want to advocate that when we're thinking about our museums of science, we should be thinking more on the model of the Agora and less on the models of the cathedral or the playground. Why do we need science museums to be agoras? There's a very simple argument here, and it is an argument. It's essentially a political argument, and I'm happy to pursue that argument with anyone who wants to pursue it. But I would take as a starting point something that you've heard from previous speakers already. Science is embedded in our cultures. It's embedded globally. It's embedded deeply. And I would say that unless we suffer, as we could, as a species, a catastrophic collapse, we should never rule out that possibility, it's embedded permanently. Let's hope It's embedded permanently in our cultures. If that's the case, and because science drives endless social changes, I think we all probably agree with that, and because those changes raise profound issues for our societies, there's no escaping that, and this is crucial, and because the issues raised by science often go far beyond the merely scientific. That's the sense in which I would possibly want to differ with our keynote speaker, who offered us the formula that science is human society. I don't think it is. There's all sorts of questions that we face that are very definitely not scientific by their character, but they may well involve science in order to solve them. So the question, for example, what we should do to combat climate change is not a scientific question. Science cannot answer that question, or if it does, it is pretending to a role that it truly does not have. Science can contribute facts, and thousands and millions of them, which are relevant, but in the end, they are social and political questions that we have to resolve if we want to decide what we're going to do about climate change. So there's an example of an issue that we face that is deeply connected to science, but which goes beyond science, but we need to sort it out. And we're doing, frankly, globally, a really, really bad job of doing that right now. So because of all these things, I would say, particularly for those of us who are fortunate enough to live in democratic societies, or perhaps societies that like to think of themselves as being democratic. I speak as an English person currently living in America. We need continuing conversations between scientists and citizens to contribute to the resolution of these issues. What alternative do we have? If we don't have those conversations, either we're going to live in some kind of technocracy where people who happen to have a lot of information get to make all these non-scientific decisions. Not a good place to be. Or we're going to live in a place where the decision makers just go ahead blithely without science. And that's not a good place to be either. So if you want to avoid either of those bad outcomes, you better have the opportunity to have sustained conversations about issues that are deeply embedded in our cultures and that require science to help us as we go about solving them. And I know no other way to sort out those issues than by having discourse, civic conversation about them. Once, long ago, an English physicist and novelist called C.P. Snow wrote in the course of another rather famous essay that the scientists, as he put it, have the future in their bones. And the question I'm asking is, what sort of future do we want? In democracies, that must be decided one way or another by citizens. So how are we going to engage citizens in these civic conversations that I'm arguing we need? If we're in a museum, we have, I would say, a very special opportunity to contribute, not uniquely, not alone, but along with others, to the pursuit of these civic conversations. If we take seriously our role as meeting grounds or forums, then I suggest we had better think about targeting not just families and children. And by the way, for the last 100 years, science museums have been better at dealing with and responding to children than they have at responding to adults. It's been a worldwide trend, and it continues. Just compare the audiences that go to science museums with those that go to art museums, and you see a huge difference immediately, everywhere I've ever looked. Art museums tend to overwhelmingly get responses from adults. Science museums overwhelmingly get responses from... I used to work in the Science Museum London. It used to be known as the 3 visits in a lifetime museum. You went when you were 8. You know how this goes. You went when your children were 8, and you went when your grandchildren were 8. The common factor was you had to have an 8-year-old with you, or you didn't really go. That's the reality of... I'm going to turn off this thing that's annoying me, and you probably. That's the reality of what has happened, and it is a largely 20th century phenomenon. Museums of science were not largely for children in 1900, they were in 2000. And you can ask the question, and we could discuss it, why that is, but it's nevertheless true. If we want to be Agora, children are important. I will never say a word against the importance of educating children. But if we want to be Agora or forums, we have to start taking the adult community seriously. We need to be speaking to the citizens and not just to their children. And we need to design experiences that aren't merely instructive. Again, I don't want to speak against instruction. I'm not completely insane, but we've got to go beyond instruction. If we want to be Agora or forums, we have to design experiences that invite crucial conversations. And frankly, taking us in the round, at least as I see us, we're not very good at that. So we need to create spaces within our museums and beyond for what I would call meaningful exchange, discourse, deliberation, to use our keynote speaker's metaphor, wrestling. And we need to organize dialogues, and we need to take seriously what comes out of them. So, very briefly, the Science Museum as Agora, I'm suggesting, means a shift from a focus exclusively or mainly on children to a focus on adults. To whatever is the voting age in your country, from there on up, I suggest, needs to be taken seriously as an audience for what you're doing. And I've contrasted the kind of image I've put on the top left is what you see if you just go onto Google and Google Science Museum. You'll get many images like the one at the top left. Why? The answer is because that's what we often think we're doing, and that's how we advertise ourselves. That's what we do. No other museum sector that I'm aware of in the world preoccupies itself with young children as much as we do. If you look at the bottom right, you've got another science center which is doing a Science Night Live. The late evening shows, which have become increasingly popular among science museums, are interesting to me because they are generally targeted exclusively at adults. And it's a break. Many science museums have found it hard to do these. I was in one which took 20 years to make a success of this, because what they were doing with their late evening opening was going against their brand, which was so focused on families and children. You can't really invite children to a late evening opening. And so you saw the tension there. Science museums as agoras mean we go from spectacle to provocation. The image on the left is from the Science Museum London, a beautiful exhibition it did on mathematics some years ago. It's a breathtaking sight, though there's not too much mathematics to trouble yourself with in the exhibition. The bottom right is rather different. That pod, that blue-colored pod, was designed as a piece of technology to help people who wanted to end their own lives. It's a suicide machine. And it's a machine that allows the subject to go in and take the decisions and make the manipulations which will end their lives. I put it up there not because I'm advocating this, but because that's a very provocative exhibit right there. You can't look at that and not wonder and worry about what on earth we should be doing at the end of life, or as people decide, perhaps, that they want to end their lives. Should medicine be involved? Should doctors be involved? Should we be helping people to do that, or should we be trying to prevent them doing that? Those are good questions. They're questions that any civic community ought to be discussing. I noticed that the audience for that exhibit on the right is adult, quite appropriately. The Science Museum as Agora means that we have to go from so-called deficit thinking. This is another thing that I can use by reference to our keynote talk. We have to get beyond the idea that the only thing that matters is us, the people in the museum who know things, talking to them, the visitors in the museum who don't know things. We have to get beyond that. And everybody now seems to agree that's the case, but doing it is much harder. One group that's very bad at doing it is TED Talks. TED Talks is very famous for its online communications, but as I view them, they're almost entirely one way. You get to hear a speaker, you don't get to hear any discussion or debate or disagreement. That's that's deficit mode thinking. I'm more interested in the sort of thing you see going on the bottom right here. I don't actually know what this group is doing, but I don't think it's one way. They're having a discussion. Yes, the speaker has things to say, but they're also interested in what the audience has to say. Maybe the audience knows things the speaker doesn't. Maybe that's important. We have to go from deficit to dialogue. So, as I mentioned, I've had the luxury of, with colleagues, working out how to build a new museum, and we've been open, I should say, almost exactly a month. So we don't know much yet about how it's working, but this is a view from the outside of our building. I took the view rather intentionally because it avoids looking at the construction work still going on at ground level. You can't see that. But we occupy the piece of the building which is the first 3 floors, which is distinguished from the office buildings above. And I'm not going to go through an awful lot of what my new museum contains. I don't think you deserve me to spend my time doing that. Some of it is about MIT itself. We are the MIT Museum. A lot of it is not. I want to focus on just one exhibit, which is intended to provoke dialogue, and one programmatic space, which is intended to be a forum. So here's the exhibit. It's called, in quotes, "In Event of Moon Disaster," and that's a view from the outside of the exhibit. It's in a gallery which is about artificial intelligence, about which we've heard something today. The reality is that AI is all around us. Some of the things being done with AI we might well want to applaud. Other things that are being done with it we might not feel quite so enthusiastic. So one of the things that AI is being used for a great deal today is the creation of so-called deep fake videos. And we have a deep fake video, in fact several, at the heart of this exhibit. Why is it called In Event of Moon Disaster? That's a peek into a room, rather dark I'm afraid, with a 1960s style TV in it. Why would we in the MIT Museum have an exhibit with a late 1960s style TV? Because it was in 1969 that the Apollo program landed men, they were men, successfully on the moon. People of my age can remember it. I remember where I was when I heard about it. It wasn't in America, but I remember it. You might think to yourself, what was done in preparation for that extraordinary event? Well, I'll tell you what was done. The then President of the United States, Richard Nixon, had 2 speeches written for him. One speech, which he gave to the world, was to be given in the event that the moon landings were successful. But of course, NASA faced the very real possibility that the Apollo program would be a failure, in which case the astronauts on that first mission would have been killed. And guess what? A second speech was written for the then President of the United States that he would give to the nation in the unfortunate event that those astronauts had been killed. And that speech was called In Event of Moon Disaster. That speech survives. It's been found. And a group of artists, a couple of years ago, decided to create a deep fake video of President Nixon giving that speech that he never gave. I hope you're understanding me in translation. Why would we put this exhibit on display? Because we want our visitors to think about and to be involved in discussion of the uses of artificial intelligence, not all of which are obviously beneficial. Today, deepfakes, the biggest single area of use of them is in pornography, online pornography. We didn't particularly want to have to go into pornographic deepfakes in our museum. In Event of Moon Disaster did the job better. We want to be able to persuade viewers that there's a real problem today in knowing whether what you're seeing online is true or whether it's a fake. That's a problem handed to us in part by a sophisticated technology. We've got to have conversations about what to do about that. And our idea, through research with visitors in the exhibit and through public programs, is to open up a space for dialogue about what to do in a deepfake world. So I'm nearly done. The second thing I said I wanted to do was to show you a forum space. This is the single biggest space in the new museum, and notice that it's not a gallery. It's a meeting space. And although we've only been open about a month, we've already had a whole host of meetings in there, mainly, not exclusively, for adult audiences. So I'm just going to show you a few images. That's an audience participating in an event. We have a very, very big LED screen so we can show films or anything else we want. Here are people, actors, doing a play reading of a contemporary science-related play by a man called Ken Urban called The Moderate. I'm not going to go on to explain what that's about, but again, the play raises quite difficult questions about the moderation of online chat platforms. Here's a ballet dancer. As she dances, the images on the screen respond to her movements. So this is art, which has its place. Here's a full-scale orchestral work by a music composer who's also an MIT faculty member. The music involves art and computing as well as live instruments. None of these individual things matter. What matters is that this is a space where audiences can engage in discussion, as this audience member is doing right here, of whatever the issues are that we're discussing. Now, we do believe in spectacle. So we just completed this year's Cambridge Science Festival. We worked with an art installation company from Europe. They created a simulate. We saw from our previous speaker a beautiful set of video images of the Northern Lights, quite breathtaking, I thought. Here's a simulation using lasers of the Northern Lights in an urban environment. That's spectacle. We had thousands of people outside, some lying down in car parks. I've never seen people lying flat on their backs in a car park before, so they could look up at this. So spectacle has its place. But what I'm saying is that spectacle and amusement have their place, but in the 2020s, our visitors deserve and need more. Our societies need more. We need to have citizen engagement through the cultivation of informed conversation. That, I would argue, going forward is likely to be the single most important social role that our science museums can play. But to do that, we better make that a more important mission than we hitherto have tended to do. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Durant. So again, we will receive questions from the floor first.
John, thank you for those amazing remarks. And just to be clear, you and I are in complete agreement that it's about the relationship between communities and science. But I wanted to ask, with your amazing examples of what you've done in the Science Museum, a follow-up to a question that I was asked about your staff. How have you staffed that institution to be able to do you talked about the physical space and the design of the exhibits, but what about the positions that you've had? I think you have some really practical things that might be helpful, and I'm curious what you've learned from that experience.
Well, thank you. That's a good question. And the fact is, we're nowhere near yet where we need to be. We are under constraints as well. I was talking about these issues of constraints over one of the meal breaks. I want to be realistic. Let me just make a point. Where you're funded from for your museum is of crucial importance. We should not ignore economic issues. If you're funded, for example, as many independent museums of science are, by your Ministry of Education, you're probably going to do a lot of educational work. Guess what? Even a lot of it with school-age students, because you're mandated by your funder to do that. Now, I'm not an independent museum. We work for MIT, so I can go and try and persuade my MIT colleagues and I can be either successful or not, as to what we should be spending our money on. So we do have some staff to address your question. Well, we're just advertising at the moment for a new adult program producer. Because if you don't have somebody whose job is to work out what are the issues around which you want to create adult programs, then guess what? They won't happen. Don't pretend we're anywhere near where we need to be, but yes, I do believe we have to shift our resources a bit into the funding of this civic forum-like role. Otherwise, we're just, as they say in English, in cloud cuckoo land, hoping that it will happen, you know. So you're right. We can't neglect that. But I do want to sympathize, if you will, with colleagues who are under financial constraints, and they could be of several kinds, to do something more like the spectacle or the amusement, because I know that there are economic factors driving what a lot of institutions do in those spaces.
More questions from the floor, please?
네, 감사합니다. 원래
Thank you very much. I wanted to ask a question, and I would like to ask one more question, so I would like to ask for your understanding first. First, thank you very much for expressing your condolences, and thank you very much for coming all the way to talk about the roles and functions of the Science Museum. And in your presentation, the most interesting part for me is related to my question. In ancient Greek, there was Agora, and you also talked about the role of Science Museum as Agora. I haven't looked up your previous presentation, so based on your current presentation, the Science Museum space can serve, I think it is reduced to the science space instead of the political discussion space. So now I think you are trying to recover the role of the Science Museum as Agora. I guess you agree with me. And you are from the Western culture, and we are living in Korea. And as for the civic discussion or political discussion, we have many limitations in Korea. Currently, if the National Science Museum tries to have a political discussion, then the government will not allow. So in the future, when science museums facilitate political discussion, then there should be more concrete model or concrete examples from Western countries. So can you provide that?
Well, thank you for that question. I think I understood it. I would want to say a couple of things. Yes, I admit that my experience is from the Western world, and whatever I'm saying needs to be put through or fired in the crucible of local cultures, in this case, the Korean culture. And there can be no, in my view, no universal simple solutions to how you work out such complicated issues worldwide. I would say that. Secondly, I would say science museums should not pretend to be the only places in a culture where there is civic discourse. Not every issue that a culture deals with has an important scientific element that's crucial to it, or is even raised, perhaps, as in deepfakes, by the advances in science and technology. Not every issue is like that. So I am a pluralist, as it were. I think we need multiple sites in our culture for these discourses to take place. But I'm trying to say that one good place for some of them is museums of science. I didn't go into this, but I think we all know that generally, around the world, museums of science still have a high level of trust or confidence. They are seen as credible places by many members of the public, and especially in the culture I come from, being credible as an actor is really important right now, where there's so much distrust of governmental and other kinds of institutions. So I would say we are one contribution to solving the problem of civic discourse. Now, when it comes to the question of what you are allowed to do, I agree, you have to work very circumspectly, very carefully in your culture. I would say not every conversation that we need to have is overtly political in the sense that might concern an elected government. So, for example, I raised a question quickly with that illustration of the euthanasia machine, if you want, the killing machine. We might want to have discussions which are really ethical in nature, which are about the moral choices that we have to make about various kinds of issues, moral questions which may be thrown up by new technical or practical capabilities that are offered to us from the worlds of science and technology. Perhaps our political paymasters may be more tolerant of some of those conversations, but of course if we're paid by a governmental agency, then I guess we have to have an ongoing close dialogue with that branch of government so that we can decide with them what is appropriate for us to be doing and what is not. So I want to be respectful of all those constraints, but I do think there are opportunities here for museums of science. And I would ask the question, perhaps rhetorically, for a particular set of issues which do have a technical component, if we're not the forum for discussion, what is? Where will this discussion go on? And if it doesn't go on, how are we hoping that wise decision-making in our cultures is taking place? So that's the best I can do by way of answer.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for the presentation. I really resonate with the idea of the museum as Agora. And I wonder, how do you involve the researchers? Because you are a very characteristic museum. You are inside in one of the best universities in the world, so you are surrounded by researchers. And I think that the role that a science museum has to do is not only to reach citizens, as you said, but also reach the researchers and help and being supportive in this dialogue between research and other actors in society to think about new questions. And so how do you work with them, and what are your dreams for the future about that?
It's another very good question. I think that networking with and sustaining relationships with the researchers across MIT is one of our principal obligations. We could spend 7 days a week doing that because there are hundreds and hundreds of these researchers and we're just one museum. But I think it's crucial for what we do that science does need to be part of the dialogues that I'm talking about. There's not much point in organizing a dialogue on a science-related issue if there are no relevant scientists or no relevant scientific expertise in the conversation. It's like, why did you do that, you know? So I completely agree with you. And you get mixed responses. I like to say sometimes the only single thing that I know that scientists have in common is that they're scientists. If you try to name any other personal characteristic, including a willingness to go and talk with non-scientists, you'll find they are very varied. Some you couldn't get them there if you dragged them with a horse. And others just love it and do it all the time, and they would do it even if you didn't ask them to. And there's everything in between. So eventually, of course, you're prejudiced to work more with those who are willing to work with you than the others who won't. But in my experience, at least in the places I've worked, there's no real shortage of scientists and engineers who see the relevance. Many of them will say, quite rightly often, my work is funded from the public. You know, I mean, a lot of MIT researchers, not all, but a lot, have their work funded by a federal grant-giving agency. And they will say, you know, it's what Americans call taxpayer dollars that are funding my work. I have an obligation to go and talk to the public about how I'm spending their money. You'll hear that. So we don't have a shortage, really, of experts who are willing to participate. Persuading them to get involved in dialogues like this, rather than just, as it were, giving an account of their work. That can be trickier, but I think our job in part is to try and persuade expert scientists, I would argue, that the long-term interest of their subject is in them being willing to get involved in discourse, yes, about the great hopeful stories coming out of their work, but they shouldn't shy away from the problems. We're talking at the moment with a lot of neuroscientists, and there are great stories coming out of brain science in all sorts of ways today, but there are also quite a lot of quite difficult questions to answer about the implications of research on long-term degenerative mental illnesses and so on and so on. So we need to be able to talk about science and technology, the upsides and the downsides, in an open way if we want to carry the public with us. If not, I think we risk alienation and polarization, and the country I live in at the moment is, I think most Americans that I know would say, is horribly polarized. And some issues, it's very hard to get civic discourse. You know, there are jokes. America has this wonderful annual holiday called Thanksgiving, where you traditionally go back to your family. The standard joke is that less and less people want to go home for Thanksgiving because they dread some of the conversations that they might have around the Thanksgiving meal table. That's an example of how polarization is pulling some cultures, including, I think, parts of America, apart. We should be part of the opposite trend, I think, of trying to pull people together. And doing that, I think we need to say to the experts, you have a role in helping to cross those bridges, unite the divides, persuade people who might be skeptical even about whether they want to talk to a scientist or engineer, that maybe they should. So that's how I see it.
I think we have a time for one more short question. So, yeah.
It was an interesting lecture. Thank you very much. I'm studying museum in KAIST. So I'm a researcher, and KAIST is kind of MIT in Korea. And in KAIST, we are preparing a museum. And in your presentation, you talked that Science Museum needs to shift the focus from family and children to adult and other citizens. And it was very impressive. So when it comes to the audience development, I would like to ask a question. In Science Museum, if we want to attract more adult audiences, what kind of policy should be implemented and strategy should be employed? And MIT Museum is very prestigious, so there might be some groups who cannot access to MIT Museum. So if some audiences feel that museum is too distant from them, what kind of effort did you make so that you can attract more audiences that are not familiar with MIT Museum?
These are good questions. Thank you. There is no simple answer to them. I want to just make one general point, which again I made in discussion over lunch, I think, with some people. It is well known by social researchers that there are significant parts of the community, any community I think that I'm aware of anywhere in the world, significant parts of that community that go regularly to museums, and there are other significant parts which never set foot in them. If you ask them, when's the last time you went to a museum, they will just say, never. So in England, there used to be a reference by researchers to the museum-going public. So now here's a dilemma. If you want to reach all sections of the community, our keynote speaker referred to issues about diversity and inclusion. I would draw from that the conclusion you shouldn't stay within the four walls of your building all the time. If you do, you're probably not going to reach the people who never come to a museum. And by the way, I would just say, if you're called the MIT Museum, that problem could be even worse, because MIT locally has the reputation that only people with two heads go there. You know, you've got to have or very big cerebral hemispheres. You know, it's got a reputation as being a tough place, a place where people do things that you might not necessarily understand. So that doesn't help a museum that's trying to reach out to them. So we tried to break the image of MIT as an elite place And we do it in all sorts of ways, and they're not perfect. But I think you have to try. So we decided when we built the new museum that we were going to go free admission to all residents in our local city, Cambridge. We never were free admission, but we wanted to send a signal, because some of the people who live in Cambridge are quite wealthy, but some are not. And so we wanted not to have a barrier of admission price preventing local people coming to see us. That's just one thing. There are many others. We've now translated introductions to our key galleries into 6 languages because we're a multilingual community. This may be a surprise to people who are not familiar with America. My youngest son recently graduated from high school in our local Cambridge high school. When they had the graduation outside with all of the graduating seniors, they introduced the graduation 23 times, which seems like 22 times more than necessary, except that every single introduction was in a different language, and it was a different language spoken at home by some of the students in that school. If you're in a multilingual community and you only insist on working in one language, you're going to exclude people who are not so comfortable in that language. So we have such a lot to learn about how to be inclusive. And if you're in the Korean equivalent of MIT, great, but you may have similar problems. You may be regarded by some Koreans as great, and by others as, I don't know, I never liked math, or whatever. So you have to find a way around this, subvert stereotypes, and make extra efforts to reach parts of the community that otherwise might not come.
Thank you very much, Professor Durant, for the wonderful conversation. Please give a big hand for Professor Durant again. And now we have our third presenter, Professor Sungook from Seoul National University. His presentation is entitled, "What Can Participatory Science Museums Learn from Modern Art?"
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me to this very interesting and prestigious international conference. 예, 지금부터는 한국말로.
I'm going to make my presentation in Korean.
제가 처음에 사실 이 학회에서 그 강연 요청을 받았을 때
When I was first asked to make a presentation for this symposium, I decided that my talk will be on this title. For the past 10 years, I looked at collaboration between scientists and artists, and I had many chances to witness such collaboration. And in some events, I functioned as a moderator of such collaboration, and today I would like to share with you some of the observations that I had, and maybe I can provide some of my inputs for the role of science museums and science centers. So I was preparing my slides for this talk, and on October 8th, Bruno Latour, the philosopher, passed away. And Bruno Latour is the person who played the most important role for the study of STS. So I wanted to begin my talk with the story of Bruno Latour. So that's why I included the subtitle, which is In Memory of Bruno Latour. So Latour is a French philosopher, and he's a science and technology studies scholar. He's the one who proposed the actor network theory. And in this actor network theory, he proposes a concept of non-human agency. So humans are not the only agents, but there are also non-human agents. And there should be symmetry between human agency and non-human agency. There were many concepts that he developed, and one thing that's really interesting for me is the concept of matter of concern. So the things that we are interested in or things that are really important for us. And so far, I've been working on these different concepts. Unfortunately, I don't have a lot of time to explain what's matter of fact and what's matter of concern, but according to Latour, CO2 is a matter of concern, and there are a lot of discussions that are taking place around CO2. It is an important element, but if we really think about it, seeing its increase in our atmosphere, rising the global temperature, we do have a lot of uncertainties surrounding it at the sometimes leads to political controversy. Also, Freon is another matter of concern, or Prion is another matter of concern. Matter of fact should be shown as constructed, but matter of concern should be dealt with something else. And as we grapple with the concept of matter of concern, what kind of approach do we have to have? And another concept that he proposed is what's called the Parliament of Things. Usually the parliament is a place where politicians are convened to have discussions on different matters. But what if we have a parliament of things? What if we have the representatives who are related to the matter of concerns? What if we involve non-human agents? Of course, it is highly abstract, and in Parliament of Things, there are 4 different chambers. There is a room of perplexity, consultation, institution, and hierarchy. I'm not going to explain all the chambers in this talk, but in this Parliament of Things, it is regarded as a conceptual and material space where inclusion of non-humans and matter of concern is also included, and it also embraces uncertainty. And here, there is participation, deliberation, and collaboration among various parties. And it does not just involve scientists or politicians, but also we have artists, philosophers, and science and technology studies scholars. So that's a brief explanation on what the Parliament of Things is. So Latour himself, to practice his ideas, had a lot of engagement with artists. And the director, Peter Bible, and ZKM, he worked with him to organize an exhibition. In 2005, they organized an exhibition titled Making Things Public. And he organized this exhibition in order to embrace matter of concerns in democracy. And he invited philosophers, artists, and SDS scholars in the relevant discussions, and the outcome of such discussions were exhibited. After this exhibition in 2005, At a cocktail party, Latour meets a scientist, and scientists did not like him because for them he has disregard on scientific facts, and he's known as person who dismisses scientific facts. At the end of 1990s, there was a science war, and Latour was the target of a lot of scientists. But in 2009, in this party, Latour meets with a very famous climate scientist, and this scientist approaches him and says, I need help from you, so please help us. Because we are being attacked, we are under attack. More and more people are suspicious about climate change. They don't believe it's really happening. And politicians and a lot of general public do not understand that it's really happening. So we need your help. And that's when Latour started to work on climate change. And that led to the publication of this book. Facing Gaia, Down to Earth after lockdown. And recently this year, this is yet to be translated into English. We have the Korean version, and on the emergence of an ecological class, it's already translated into Korean. Until the moment that he passes away, he traveled around the world to talk about the climate change crisis and talked about how all the stakeholders have to work together and how to engage the civic society. And unfortunately, this year, suddenly he passed away. As he was working on these topics, he put together another exhibition involving artists. And the title of this exhibition was Critical Zones. And it happened also once again at ZKM, and the exhibition occurred in 2020. And hundreds of pages of images were put together as a book, and it was published. Probably a lot of you do not know what critical zone is. Critical zone is a heterogeneous near-surface environment in which complex interactions involving rock, soil, water, air, and living organisms regulate the natural habitat and determine the availability of life-sustaining resources. Well, this is a scientific definition of critical zone, and according to Latour, these critical zones are generated over eons of time by various life forms, and these critical zones form a surface only a few kilometers thin. So there's soil and plants or the trees and the atmosphere. So if you look at the picture, including the atmosphere, it only spans a few kilometers, and that's what's the critical zone. And what Latour says is that the Earth is not a globe. It's not a globe. It is a critical zone. The Earth is not a globe. The Earth is a critical zone, he says. And that's what we call Gaia. Or it's what we call the terrestrial. That's the key awareness that Latour reached in his study. This is the blue marble. I'm not sure whether it was Apollo 17 or 18, so it was a picture taken by the Apollo mission. This image is quite popular. You see, the Earth itself is a globe. But from this space, from this image, you don't really see the critical zone The radius of the Earth is 6,000 kilometers, and the critical zone spans only 10 kilometers, so you don't really see the 10 kilometers within which a lot of life-related interactions occur. But if you take the picture of the globe, you don't really see the critical zones. Those are not visible. Then how can we visualize the critical zones? We have these rich interactions taking place in the critical zone among various life forms. And then how do we visualize the emergence, pulsation, proliferation, and emergency of life in this patchy, heterogeneous, and this continuous critical zone? This is the question that Latour wanted to find answers to. We have this powerful platform of life, and how can we make that this critical zone stand out in the image of the globe? In 2014, Latour published a paper on critical zone, but if you read the paper, you don't see any images of the critical zone. It's highly abstract, and you need the visualization of the critical zones so that it could create a strong impression on people's mind. But unfortunately, this paper did not include any visual images of the critical zone. Later, Latour met with other people from other fields and had collaboration. And there was an interaction with an artist called Alexandra Arines. And he also worked with a geochemist. And also he worked with an landscape architect. His name is Galidar Det. And by working with these people, in 2018, he publishes yet another paper on the critical zone. And he included this diagram to try to visualize the critical zone. So if you look at the Earth, the critical zones exist in this very thin surface of the Earth, and underneath you have the mantle and other Earth components. And this diagram is the inside out of the Earth structure, like this. So you have the mantle at the outermost, which is not really critical for the life on Earth, and inside you have the critical zone in the circle. So the circle, which can probably represent the Earth, the entire circle itself is the critical zone. So this is how Latour visualized the critical zone. I got this picture from the RN's website. This is Earth, and if you look at the section of the Earth, you have the mantle and you only have the thin layer of the critical zone, but you reverse it and put the mantle at the outermost area and then put the critical zone inside the circle, and you have the rock, topsoil, and the tree canopy and atmosphere. So this is the Earth. This is the Earth that he sees it, a meaningful space for all of us, which contains all the life forms on Earth, and all the solar atmospheric actions take place with full of life, and different species evolve. All the chemical elements exist and move around to influence different life forms, and the life organisms or living organisms change the atmospheric structure. So all those happen in the critical zone. If we represent the Earth in this way, the critical zones represent the entire space that we reside in and the 8 billion human population on Earth, damaging the critical zone, which is the thin layer on the surface of the Earth. And we also include the sun to visualize the critical zone, and this is the result of such visualization. And this is how Naturu sees the interaction between art and STC. So without doing an exhibition, I wouldn't have used the art, so to speak. Now I'm very good at learning from artists, and it does fit me because the whole thing we do on Love Vlog, Break, Gaia, the whole work I introduced was completely inspired by the artists and my work with them. We did plays from which I learned enormously. It's about creating a situation, an exhibition, or play where you learn new ways to think about your topic from the artists. The idea for my book, Facing Gaia, actually started with a dancer. So in a small workshop, there was a dancer who performed. And watching her perform, or watching him perform, he thought Gaia is like dancing. The Gaia that we used to call is dancing. And from the moment he developed new concepts on climate change. The critical zone, the very concept of the critical zone is not my invention. Scientists use this concept, but in a narrower sense than how I use it. The reason why I extended it to materialization and images and so on, like the paper we did with Alexandra, is that it is of great interest to scientists. Suddenly they see in this diagram made by Alexandra with my advice. These diagrams are scientific, so to speak, but without art, science would have failed to represent what it wishes to show. So you have a constant exchange because science is entirely about representation and visualization. So is mythology. So this is what is said to talk about and highlight the interaction between art and science. So going back to the Parliament of Things, so I talked about the different chambers of the Parliament of Things. It's a conceptual and material space, and there are non-human agents, and there are also matters of concerns, and it also embraces uncertainty, and there are different forms of participation, deliberation, and collaboration among scientists, the public, artists, and STS scholars. But think about it. What is this space? There are non-human agents, and there are also scientists, artists, philosophers get together to think about and discuss the non-human agents and human agents. Maybe that should be, or that is the role of science centers and science museums. If you look at the traditional role of science museums and science centers, from the beginning, those traditional science museums promoted the interaction, or such interaction. And there are many common bonds between science and art, and they both begin with noticing and recording patterns, spatial patterns, patterns in time, patterns of process and behavior. They both elaborate, reformulate, and ultimately link together patterns in nature and meaning, which initially appears as unrelated. Both art and science are involved with order, disorder, transitions, and the creation of tension and the relief of tension. Both endeavors are deeply rooted in culture and heritage. Both expand our awareness and sensitivity to what is happening in nature and in ourselves. Who do you think this person is? Who said that?
Triangle of Tanagari. The
was Frank Oppenheimer. Frank Oppenheimer is the person who created Exploratorium, who materialized the collaboration between art and science. So you see some of the early days of planetarium in the picture. And he hired August Coppola and to build the tactile dome. And it was quite popular back then. It's a pitch dark space inside the tactile dome, and if you are inside, you don't really see anything. And then you have to rely on other senses to have the experience. August Coppola is the father of Nicolas Cage, the Hollywood famous actor. So you see the picture. Nicolas Cage is really popular because he used to have a Korean wife. Frank Oppenheimer, of course, materialized the collaboration between artists and scientists, but he also initiated the Artist in Residence program. He was really interested in art because he thought science may not be exhibitable. Because if you understand the nature of science, it may not be exhibitable. And to turn it exhibitable, a lot of tension can be created. And by infusing art into science, such tension can be resolved. That was his belief. So combining art with science can reduce the tension or mitigate the tension. And at the same time, we can turn science into something that's playful and enjoyable. When he was alive, that was during the Cold War and the Second World War. He was mistaken as a communist, and also we understand that his brother suffered a lot because he was also mistaken as a communist. So he went through a really difficult times, and he believed the education of science will be really important for our future generation, and for him it was his mission. And in order to realize his mission, he worked with many different kinds of people, and he created an open exploratorium in San Francisco, which is believed to be the first science museum in the world. Of course, now we are living in a different world from Frank Oppenheimer's. So, in these current times, because of the climate change, the critical zones are in danger. The entire humanity is faced with a great danger. Probably most of you understand that the climate crisis is very serious. If we continue the current level of global temperature rising, the entire Earth will be in danger, and we will see a lot of tensions, and we will lose our habitat, and we will see different types of conflicts and war breaking out. And we are not immune to that. We will suffer from it as well. So the issue is really serious, but there are not a lot of things that we can do, some people feel. And of course, we feel really powerless, even though we face this global crisis. So, under the circumstances, maybe we can learn from art. Especially the participatory science museums can learn from the modern art. By having more collaboration between art and science, I think science museums and science centers can function as a parliament of things. And science museums and science centers can also function as observatory of the critical zones. And by doing so, it can help our society to mitigate the current crisis, or at the end, help overcome the current crisis. Maybe that should be the role of science museums and science centers going forward. With that, I would like to conclude my presentation. Thank you very much for your listening.
Thank you very much, Professor Hong. Again, we are going to gather questions from the floor.
Thank you. I just want to say how much I enjoyed that talk. Thank you. And I wanted to, two things. I wanted to point to the obvious overlap between some of the things you were saying and some of the things that our first speaker this afternoon, Professor Mohri Mamoru, was saying. He actually gave better, more modern visualizations than the original Apollo ones for what Latour calls the critical zone. And I just saw a lot of resonance between your two talks, so I just wanted to point that out. I wanted also to ask a question, because that's what I'm supposed to do, about artists. I completely agree with you and with Frank Oppenheimer. Working with artists is a way to go, and it's been done for many years. I just want to invite you to comment on the different roles that artists can play in science centers. The example you gave is close to the role of the artist as illustrator, and artists can help to illustrate difficult concepts. But I think they have many other roles. I'm also struck that artists can sometimes see an issue in a way that maybe scientists don't see it, and can, as it were, upend our ways of viewing and help us to see things in more than one way. And I'm also struck that artists can also sometimes raise questions in very powerful ways. So I just wonder if you could comment on the different roles that artists, in your view, should be playing in our science museums.
Thank you very much for your very interesting question. 제가 개인적으로 이제 과학자와 예술가들과의
So I have a lot of interactions with artists, and I also facilitated a lot of interactions and collaboration between artists and scientists. And as you just said, I also realized that there are many different roles that artists can play, but a lot of times scientists do not understand such roles that artists can play. When scientists collaborate with artists, they just believe that such scientific concepts can be better illustrated by artists. If we explain something difficult easily to an artist, then they can use different types of media or artistic forms to easily explain the different concepts into the to the general public in an easy to understand manner. So they only see this collaboration unilaterally. That's what I observed from the collaboration between scientists and artists. So to make such collaboration more productive, they have to have longer engagement at least. And I think the role of the moderator or the facilitator is really important. You need somebody who understands the both words, the languages of both words, to understand the different cultures of these different two words. So there should be somebody who can mediate between these two different circles. Sometimes scientists can be greatly inspired by the artists. Maybe they can see things that they haven't seen, or they can understand things that they have disregarded. So they can develop different ways of observing the world. And I witnessed a lot of examples of such. I wanted to share with you some of those examples today, but unfortunately, the topic of my talk was something different. So I think you have to be more patient as scientists and have a longer term perspective on the collaboration that scientists have with artists. And you need to have the facilitation of a really good moderator who understands both words. And maybe we can create programs at science museums and to be able to involve both scientists and artists by giving different roles for artists. Thank you very much for your presentation. I think for me, science is difficult and art is also difficult. So you talked about the role of the moderator to link the artists and scientists. Then who can serve as the moderator in Korea? So a person like me. So there are some people who have engagement with the both words, and maybe we also need to nurture such moderators who can really combine artists and scientists who really witness and observe such collaborations in the field and develop their skills to better facilitate such a collaboration. When I first began my career, I didn't have good understanding on art, and I had, to be frank with you, I had some bias towards the modern contemporary art. I can draw that. I can also make similar things on my own, but understanding how artists work and by observing how actually they perform, I started to understand that this is not something that I can also do. This also requires a lot of training and skills and knowledge. So that's what I learned from my observation of artists. So if we have better understanding on the roles of the moderators, maybe we can have some programs operated by science museums. And I also teach at a university on the collaboration between artists and scientists. And usually the students in my classroom are scientists. And like me, sometimes they are not really knowledgeable about art. Sometimes they have some bias on art. But after taking my lecture, sometimes they have a sort of culture shock and they obtain new insights on how they can work with artists. And maybe I hope that similar courses will be also offered by other universities and colleges as well.
Because of the time limitation, it's unfortunate that we have to finish our Q&A here, and also we have to finish our first plenary session. Before that, please give a big hand to Professor Hong again, please. And again, thank you very much for all three speakers today who shared their views and engaged in wonderful conversation with all of us. I look forward to a more continued discussion about the civil participation of science and the role of Science Museum thereafter. Thank you very much, and we would like to call it an end as the first plenary session. Thank you very much.